This presentation is about Cayenne, and I know this group is a little familiar with Cayenne, unlike Linktrust, so I will not be focusing that much on what Cayenne is, but rather like what we are doing with it now. So what's new in that? But still a short introduction. It's a mature, easy-to-use Java ORM, and it should be easy to get into if you're familiar with UIF. It is licensed under Apache 2 license. It's developed at Apache Software Foundation, which is a great group of people and a great group of projects. And it's different from other ORMs on the market, and that's a topic of a different conversation as well. Today we'll be talking about Cayenne 4.0 and what's new in Cayenne 4.0. And the first thing that's new is that it wasn't actually called 4.0 before. We renamed it just recently because there was so much new stuff, new APIs. So it was 3.2. So the latest release is 4.0.m2. M1 was still 3.2. As you see, we have lots of new features, almost 100 new features since last milestone. And I guess we should just release more often. That's the biggest API upgrade ever, easily, because we changed the style, so we made everything type safe and so on, and fluent. And I will use the term DSL again. And there's a number of new major features that weren't there at all, like database cryptography, for instance. Runtime requirements, and the requirements are pretty much, they're pretty vanilla. So we stopped supporting Java 5. We are supporting Java 6, 7, and 8, and I'd really love to stop supporting 6, but I'm not sure how many people are still on it. I think, even people who are using Java 6, they want to get off of it. And I think in April, Oracle stopped supporting Java 7, so 8 is like the only real Java supported these days. But anyways, we still look to, if people are using it, we will support it. So the first major area of improvement is configuration. And those who were in Montreal 2 years ago, they know I'm big on dependency injection and how to configure everything in an isolated manner with no static singletons or anything. So we continue to improve this API and improve the API for customizing your stack for to be able to use the stack in unit tests. And some special stacks for some special cases. The first thing that we do is decorator support and dependency injection. I will show the examples. Then we have this server runtime builder, a new DSL for building Cayenne runtime. We've improved schema update strategy that allows you to actually load the database schema when you start Cayenne, if you want to. We have some simplifications to the model, like DataNode-Free Projects. DataNode is, for those who don't know, it's a model of a database. So you can have in your model, you can have multiple databases, and your mapping can be mapped to different data stores. But most people don't care about it, so we simplified that. We added a default and mapping-free projects, which is totally odd in the ORM context. Anyways, decorators. So essentially, add module is how you add customizations to your dependency injection container. And our previous way of doing that was to actually define a new service. So if you have something standard in Cayenne, but you want your own implementation, you swap it to your own. And this is not always what you want, because you'll have to write lots of boilerplate code, or you have to inherit from a class that you may not want to do that. So instead, we allow to decorate the existing services. And being true to Cayenne dependency injection philosophy of no bytecode enhancement, no dynamic proxies, not messing up with Java code. So the decorator is just really written the way you would write a decorator if you read the Java design patterns book. So it's a classic decorator pattern where we inject a decorated object, and the container takes care of providing this to us. And we alter some message behavior. Here I'm just adding login, but really we can do anything. We can suppress the call to the decorated object. So that's a new concept in DI. Now server runtime builder, and so in 3.1 we introduced server runtime. So that's this object and that you can have as many of them as you want in your applications. That is a Cayenne stack. That's a full Cayenne stack with some mapping. And what server runtime is really, it's a dependency injection container with a bunch of services in it, and you can have multiple of those with different policies or whatever. So that's very flexible. One thing you can do is you can load multiple mappings in one project in runtime. So your mappings can come from libraries. And here's how you would do it in 3.1. You need to create a string array and pass it to server runtime. So all the parameters need to be passed to the constructor. So you need to assemble them elsewhere and then give it to server runtime. In 4.0 we have a server runtime builder. So you would create a builder. You can assign it a different name, and you can add these configs with methods, and then you can do other things as well, and then you call build and you get your server runtime. So we separate the runtime objects from the builder. So that's really handy. Another example is you might want to define a data source when you start Cayenne stack. And originally this could be mapped in your project, and it still can be mapped, but like if you want to run a unit test, for instance, in 3.1, you would need to create your own data source factory. So you need to write a whole class with a bunch of methods and then bind it in DI. And if you see, I'm using Java 8 syntax here. It's a lambda. So in 4.0, builder has the methods to actually switch the database. So if you're in the unit test environment, for instance, you use that. And this doesn't affect how you obtain the connection in runtime. Another thing is schema update strategy. Schema update strategy is an interface that tells Cayenne what to do when it starts in regards to the database schema. And by default, it does nothing, so it assumes your schema is synchronized and the model and the schema are in sync. But sometimes you want to create the schema, and unit test again is a good example. But not only that. I mean, maybe you are shipping some product to your client, and you want to, you have an installer that creates the schema. So that's what this does. So originally you could only define it in the XML, and this it was a wrong place for it, so it wasn't very usable. So right now you can define it when you create your runtime, and depending on where you are, you can define a different strategy. So this one defines a creative no schema strategy, which is ideal for unit tests. DataNode-Free Projects, I already touched on that. So essentially, we're removing non-essential parts of the mapping, so you don't need to map your database in your XML, because we'll create that for you when we start the runtime. A more strange kind of thing is mapping-free project. So ORM is all about mapping, right? So you map your tables to your Java classes, but sometimes Cayenne is a powerful database stack, so you can run a raw SQL using Cayenne stack, and I found it useful in many contexts. So we essentially make sure that you don't need a mapping. The server runtime will still start. There won't be any entities, but you can run SQL, and our SQL capabilities are really strong. You can script the templates and stuff like that. So it's a good and useful thing. Okay. Now the APIs, and APIs is something. There are very few people excited about configurations. Probably me and like two more guys somewhere. So most people are using query API to interact, and context to interact with the database. So that's where you spend 90% of the time, when working with an ORM. So we introduced something that was long overdue. We introduced Fluent Query API. We improved the iterators, and I will show you what it is if you don't know. We introduced positional parameter bindings that we saw in the link rest presentation, and we have better transaction API. So for the queries, and again here I'm contrasting what we had in 3.1, what's a classic Cayenne, so to speak, versus what we have in 4.0. And in Cayenne, as you may know, there are many types of queries. So we have select query, we have SQL template, we have different query objects that are executing queries in their own way. So select query is number one thing. That's what you use to get data. And in 4.0, instead of that, we use an object select, which is, as you see, much less code. If you just squint a little bit and see just how much code is on top, and it's much less code in the bottom. Besides, the old one is not type safe in 3.1. In 4.0, we actually made select query improvements, which also made it type safe. So here, this DSL, it's very short, and it's a pleasure to use. I've been refactoring my code the last couple of months, and it's really just all like minus signs and Git, where it just removes lines. So another query, another example is SQL template. That's our classic way of, and it's still available. It's still used for updates, I think. Where you could create this template with parameters to run raw SQL, and sometimes you have to do it even though you have an ORM, right? Same problems as with select query. It's Java Bean style. It is hard to bind parameters. You need lots of boilerplate to like suppress warning and stuff like that. So the new version of selecting SQL template is SQL select. It works exactly the same, except that it's shorter, and it's type safe also. So here I'm selecting data rows, for instance. I don't need to tell it to select data rows. It just sort of knows because of the first method. So I'm not selecting objects. I'm selecting dictionaries. A new type of query is select by ID, and we had pretty good API to actually get objects by ID, because that's what everybody wants. And no matter what they say about your ID being hidden and not accessible, everybody still uses that. People still want objects by ID. So the old way, and it is still available, was to use Cayenne object for PK, and it's nice, type safe and all, except that it doesn't have cache controls. It doesn't have prefetching, which is also sort of related to cache controls. We introduced a new type of query, select by ID, and you can do the same thing, except you can also control whether you get a fresh object or an object from the cache. And the same is true for related objects, because prefetching, you may think of it as performance optimization technique, but in many cases it's a cache control technique, and that's what it is in this query. Now the iterators. Here I don't even have side-by-side examples, because 3.1 takes the whole slide. Iterators is something in Cayenne that allow you to handle large result sets. So what if you have a job that has to go through 1 million objects in the database table? So how do you fit all that in memory, right? So you would use an iterator over an open result set. And you would go through the objects one by one and do some processing, maybe like process 5 objects, do a commit, and then process another 5 objects, do a commit, and so on. So in 3.1, lots of boilerplate. So there's like double try catch, for Christ's sake. It's and there's a checked exception thrown in the iterator. Well, because the result set that is open in the backend, it throws the exception. So we figured, user needs to know about it. Well, I guess they don't. So we can do something like this instead. And here I have 2 examples, actually. The first one is an external iterator, where you actually get an iterator object, and then you go through it and you have to close it. And in M3, which is still not in the release, but it's already in Git, we simplified even that. You can use try with the resources as Java 7 feature, so you don't need to close it. Java will close it for you, and you can put it in for loop. You couldn't do it previously, so it's iterable, so you can put it in for loop. And then there's an internal iterator, which is even better, even less code. You don't need to close anything, you don't need to iterate. So it's all done by the context, and you just put a lambda in there or an anonymous in a class if you're in Java 7. And another improvement that's still not in M2 and that will be available, it's already available in Git, is batch iterators, because usually you use this in batch processing. So you don't want just one object, you want maybe 500 objects, you process them, you commit. Otherwise, you also, if you don't commit periodically, you will also run out of memory, because you'll have a bunch of changes accumulating as you go through the iterator. So there will be an API to iterate by batch, so you'll get like 500 objects until the end. So and then you don't need to have your own counter and decide when you need to commit. Okay, so that was iterators. Now positional parameter binding. It's kind of nice, and traditionally, we have many places in Cayenne, and specifically in expressions and qualifier expressions, where we have parameters, and binding parameters in Java is sort of you have to build a map, and this takes lots of code. So we figured that even though parameters are named, we can still use their positions in an var-arg array to do bindings. And the way it works is just it parses expression left to right. It finds a parameter with some name, and it takes the object from the parameter array, the object at index 0, and then it remembers that this parameter was corresponds to an object at index 0. So if it encounters $T again, it will use that same parameter. Then when it finds the second parameter, it takes the second parameter from the array, and so on. So essentially, that's a way in Java to cut down on the boilerplate to build parameters. So, and that's used in many places actually. So in Cayenne we have a few parameterized things. Transactions API. So most of you probably don't care about transactions because the framework does it for you. In Cayenne it's the same way. It's like transactions are invisible. They happen when you call commit or save changes or whatever, and you don't think about transactions until you have to. And that's when the fun starts. So that's a 3.1 transaction API. So you have to check whether there is a transaction already in progress. You have to rebind it, bind your own transaction, do whatever. So that's manual transactions in 3.1. Again, and then you need to take care of commit and rollback. Really, lots of code that's hard to understand, and it's all for the purpose of like doing 2 commits within this transaction, for instance, so that you can, for instance, if the second commit fails, you roll back the second and the first. So sometimes you need that. Sometimes you need manual transaction when you use stored procedures. I've seen cases like that. So there are these outliers, when this API becomes essential, and then you're stuck with something like this. In 4.0, we figured, you don't need to do it. So you can just write a lambda, and it can even return the result. And the result here is still somewhat meaningless. I'm just counting how many commits I did. But the point is that all this boilerplate can be folded into the framework, and that's what we did. So that's transaction API. Okay, another interesting topic. So we're done talking about new APIs. We're talking about like new features. Is protecting data with Cayenne Crypto, and Cayenne Crypto is a separate module, and Cayenne is very modular. It has this dependency injection container that allows you to put modules with configurations that does something or changes some behaviors. So that's how Cayenne Crypto is implemented. It's just a plugin that redefines a few things here and there to make encryption happen. You're all familiar with encryption of data in transit. So that's what you have with HTTPS, right? When you access a secure service, your browser and your server, they figure out how to encrypt the channel and nobody can see it. Here we are talking about data in store, and we want to protect that as well. Sometimes we want to protect it, certain data more than other data, and the situations can be, you can have, for instance, database backups, and you have all your permissions in the database and access control, but once it goes in a backup, it's stored on some disk, and all those rules are off. It's just a file. So if somebody like sends a disk to repair or whatever, so it disappears. If you have a credit card numbers or some HR records or medical records or insurance records, they will leak on the internet. Another case is log files. Like when your application logs the SQL that it generates, it's not protected again. It stays on the box, of course, but it's a different set of people who can access it as opposed to the database, which has different permissions. So logs also, and of course there's also always a possibility somebody breaks into your database server and just steals it from the source. So there are many cases when some columns have to be protected more than others, and this is a technology designed for that. And it uses AES-CBC encryption. You can probably change the cipher, but it will probably require a little more work than just swapping the name. So you should probably use that, and you can use up to 256-bit key, but you will need to, if you want to use 256 as opposed to like shorter key, you will need to install an extension from Oracle. Otherwise, Java will complain. But it's available, it's free, and the last point about customizing key stores, it's sort of important because essentially here we solve the problem of encrypting your data, and we just narrow it down to managing your key. So instead of managing secure data, which can be in many places, we narrow it down to just managing where do you store the key, because that's a symmetrical key encryption, so you have to protect your key somehow, and we'll leave it to you to handle. So you can, we design different strategies where during the deployment we put the key on the server for a short time, for a couple of seconds, the server can read it and we delete it. So stuff like that. So you can just put a flash drive and on your computer SSH the key over there with a script and then unplug it. So there are different ways you can do it. So Cayenne can encrypt character and binary columns. So essentially, it's varchar, var binary columns. They can be automatically encrypted if you want to. And we use this naming convention. If a column starts with crypto in uppercase underscore, and Cayenne crypto is in effect, it will decrypt this data. It will assume it's encrypted. But it's up to you. You can change this naming convention also with a builder that I will show in a moment. So the pattern is customizable, and you can even change the strategy. It doesn't have to be a pattern. It can be something else. I don't know. And this also supports gzip compression because encryption adds some overhead, so we want to take it back. So we want to squeeze the data. So here's an example. So the first part of it is our server runtime builder, and we have an add module call which adds a crypto module. And crypto module is its own builder, its own chain of methods that allow us to customize how encryption works. You can provide a key store URL, password to key store, whatever. So you can create a key store, you can enable compression, you can change a few other things that are maybe less relevant. And you add it to Cayenne, you start Cayenne with it, and then you write normal code. The second part of it is just plain Cayenne code. The whole point of it is that there's nothing different about it. So, and the last part, the red output, it's logs when you execute the commit. And as you see, the crypto text column is already encrypted. Even the logs already, they don't contain plain text, so you don't leak the plain text. You accept it over HTTPS from your user, you put it in an object, you save, and it's encrypted. And decryption happens also transparently, so you don't have to, other than the first part, the configuration, you don't need to do anything special. So that's a nice technique, and like I said, if you start using that, you will need to learn you'll need to think how to manage your encryption key, because that will be the key to your data. Another thing we do is OSGI support, and I'll probably skip through that because OSGI, Eclipse is an OSGI container. It's a modularity technology. So Eclipse plugins are really OSGI bundles. So Cayenne can now also be an OSGI bundle, but if you don't use OSGI, you probably care less about it. So improvements in Cayenne Modeler. And Modeler, it's Swing, so it's sort of showing its age, but we still try to, keep it comfortable, improve things here and there, just keep the usability at some level. And I will talk about things where that make the modeler less important in your workflow. This will be the last part of this presentation. So that's the modeler. We have combined attributes and relationship views, something that was requested multiple times. So previously those two were different tabs. We added this filters right here, so where you can filter your tree. just like you do in Eclipse, and you can collapse the tree. And there are projects with like hundreds of entities, really, and I know they need to be refactored into smaller projects, but until you have them, that's a lifesaver. We removed listeners from the model, and we still have callbacks on entities, which are the same thing, but they invoked in the entity objects, on data objects. But if you have an external listener, we don't want Cayenne to manage that. You put it in dependency injection, you register listeners with annotations now. And we also support operations across multiple data maps. So if you want to generate classes across your entire projects, you can do that. So this is the modular improvements. Now something else. So the most annoying part of ORM. So to me, it's the synchronization. So some people think something else is the API or whatever. So that SQL is really generated for you. Some people dislike that. I don't know, but. To me, it's the need to keep three things synchronized at all times if you want your application to work. The first is a database, then there's an ORM model, then there is a Java model. And we've been doing it already, right? So we have a Maven plugin or an Ant task or whatever. So to synchronize the map with Java model, it's called CGen in Cayenne. It works great. We have something called CDB import that synchronizes database with ORM model. Well, this thing is not so great. And also, this flow in this direction, it doesn't have to be the only direction, really, because we can go in the opposite direction if you want to. But that's sort of, I don't know, my preferred way, and many people I work with. So we are concentrating on that. If somebody likes, the opposite way, that's up for discussion as well. So we're improving this flow, and this is how it works, and it worked the same way before. So there's just a bunch of Maven code, and the important part is in the bottom, where we have CDB import goal and then the CGen goal, and so this executes those two things in sequence. However, CDB import didn't really work in 4.0 prior to 4.0. Because you could only run it once to get your schema for the first time. After that, as the schema keeps changing, if you rerun it, it will wipe out all your customizations. So you could only use it when your database schema was really well designed with names that make sense when they're translated to Java, for instance. If you need to map every single table, and if you need to map every single column, and never to rename them. And if you want relationships, in both one direction and the opposite direction, so this was your choice if you had this vanilla, really clean database schema. Most databases are not that. We have some AS400 databases, DB2 databases that they don't use underscores in naming, so there's like a string of 20 characters that are just 5 words that you cannot separate. First thing, once you do reverse engineering, you go back to your modeler and you rename the object side of it. And you need to do it repeatedly. Once you have some new tables, you get those new tables in your model. You need to go and rename them again. So you cannot run this tool again because you couldn't. Now you can. Essentially, right now we will respect all your custom changes, and we don't look at Git or anything. So we just look at the model. We keep the notion of the old model before reverse engineering and after reverse engineering. We compare them, and we keep all the old naming, so we don't destroy that. And for instance, even if some entities were not exposed on the object side, there were tables for those, but no Java classes, we will respect that as well. And all your flattened relationships and stuff like that. So CDB import is really, right now you can run it incrementally and keep changing your mapping, and you will only need the modeler for this incremental steps when you want to clean up your map. And the CGen, it worked great, and it still works. And additionally, and we added to CDB import a bunch of options, like we added filters by schema, by catalog, and include, exclude. So all this stuff was really improved, and we're still fixing some bugs, I guess, and multiple includes I think are broken in M2, but it's really right now it's a production ready tool to deal with complex schemas, and we are using it with databases that are given to us, that are not something that we design ourselves, and it's I thought it wasn't possible just a year ago. So that's how we solve this synchronization problem across different layers of your ORM. So wrapping up this presentation, so this is our resources. Of course, Cayenne.apache.org. We're lagging on documentation for all these new features. So this presentation may be something you go by initially if you want to use that. And there's also upgrade guide. That's the first place where all the new features appear. So and then they are put in the right place in documentation. We have a mailing list. We have two mailing lists, developer and user. So depending on whether you want to bring up some new feature or you want your question answered, you go to one or the other. And then we have a Stack Overflow tag also. You can subscribe to that and you can post questions there. We'll be happy to answer. So Cayenne is a community project, so everybody's welcome. And now the questions.
The iterator that you were showing us was pretty cool. I got the impression you're doing that for like some sort of long-running process. You've got 10,000 objects.
Mostly offline jobs.
Yeah.
So some scheduler process that runs scheduled jobs.
So you got like 10,000 objects, and you want to take everything that's mixed case and make it lowercase.
Right.
Something like that. Those 10,000 objects, have they been fetched already? Or are we doing 100 at a time? Is it like a top-end query?
So there are some subtleties to that, but in Cayenne, essentially, they are not fetched. So they are read from an open JDBC result set, and they are read one at a time. The subtlety is that some drivers, they require special handling because they will still read the blob, and it will sit in the driver somewhere in the JDBC layer, so it will still take some memory, but it's much less memory than the objects because it's probably just some binary blob. It allows to process I'd say hundreds of thousands easily, but probably millions. Until you have to actually go to the driver level and figure out what's wrong with that. So how to optimize the retrieval.
So that's cool, and it's worth talking about for a second because that's very different than what we've been doing in EOF. I mean, we don't have that direct cursor to the database.
Yeah, so this is a cursor, yes.
So you're able to leverage a cursor, and so you've done a fetch, and the database is holding on to it, and it's giving you one piece at a time. So you're never blowing out your memory. But when we do it, we have to either get all 10,000 objects at once, or we have to craft a top-end query, which is what we do with like an ERX batching display group. So you got 10,000 objects in theory, but you're doing, give me the items 1 through 100. Give me items 101 through 200. Right. So we don't blow out memory. So you've got a leg up on us there.
And another solution in Cayenne actually to that is a pagination of the queries. It does not require an iterator, but it returns just the IDs internally in a list, and you don't see it. You just specify the page size. And this also scales to very large result sets because, and you can keep hundreds, thousands of IDs, or you can keep 500,000 of IDs in memory easily, if it's just ID and if it's just in int array or something, as opposed to maps and data rows and whatever objects. So that's a simpler solution for if you just want pagination, if you don't want an open cursor. So this is more for offline processing because you don't want to keep it open between the requests, for instance. So you have to close it. You have to control how you close it. Otherwise, your connection pool leaks. For the UI tasks, I'd say use pagination to save memory, and Cayenne will optimize what you have in memory. And for batch processing, use iterators.
There's something you did very subtle that I fear may have gone over a lot of our heads. So I wanted to bring that up too and talk about it. When you first started talking, you said, how many of you guys are using 6 and 7 Java? You're loving Java 8. That's the subtlety I got from you. But there's another piece to that. Is that all of a sudden we started seeing these dashes with the greater than sign, like an arrow thing. And you say, oh, this is a lambda, and then keep going. I don't know if all of us have grabbed that yet. I mean, I know about it because Dave was showing me it the other day. He said, oh, there's this cool thing in Java 8. It's called lambdas. I'm like, okay, tell me about it. And I was like, oh, you're talking about blocks. That's something I had in Smalltalk years ago, or Lisp, or we finally getting it now in Java. I think you might want to ask the group to see if they know what this lambda stuff is, because the syntax that you have is so much cooler than what we do outside of Java 8. And that's the other thing, because we're people say things like, well, we're using EOF and we're closed source, but it keeps on working. It's going to continue working in Java 8 and probably 9, and there may be a time when some things are incompatible, but the other thing that I think people are yearning for is like, well, I wish we could change things so we could take advantage of maybe lambdas, but we can't because it's closed source. So maybe ask people, maybe everyone knows about lambdas, but maybe they don't, so maybe that might be worth a moment.
I think currently we have delegates, and they're pretty equal to lambdas, with the exception that you don't have the code at the exact point written where you will use it later. So if you have a delegate, you have the code somewhere else in the delegate, and you don't see it immediately at the point where you say set delegate. So this is the distinction between a delegate and a lambda, I guess.
Yeah, I think delegates are also singletons, since that you cannot have like a different delegate at a different point of execution, right? So yeah, it's sort of like a singleton service that serves the entire stack all the time.